A very warm welcome to all of you. I'm excited to see you to our newest edition of the Wellness Wednesdays. And today we will have three speakers. Well, one will come to us as a video on the topic of cognition, which of course is a very important topic when we talk about brain health. Um, as always, I want to express my deep, deep gratitude to our very generous donors without whom we would not be here, who have made all of this available for free to everybody. And I'm just incredibly inspired by the spirit of the people who are supporting us. So with that, I will hand over to Elaine, who will take over from now. Elaine.
Thanks, Sophie. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us on what is a beautiful day in Vancouver. And so for carving out this time to really dedicate towards your wellness and learn a little bit about cognition. And so as Silky mentioned, we're going to have three talks today. I'm going to start off with kind of some of the soft stuff about emotions and cognitive change and how do we cope with changes in cognition on an emotional level. And then we are going to have a talk delivered by video by Denise Kendrick, who is an occupational therapist. She was unable to join us today, so she did it by video. And then we're going to follow up with the final talk with Dr. Hakan Nagard, who is going to be talking about cognition, maybe more the hardcore stuff, and a little bit about his research as well. So I think we'll probably hold questions to the end. Certainly feel free to put some things into the chat if you have questions, and we'll try to address those as we go along. And that is our plan for today. I think we covered everything else. So we can move on to, well, actually, we'll stay here. For those of you who don't know me, I am Elaine Book, and I am the social worker at the Movement Disorders Clinic at UBC and Center for Brain Health. I've been there for about 14 years, but prior to that, have really been involved in healthcare for 30 plus years. And I've had the good fortune of being involved with the brain health, brain wellness program from the beginning, and really excited to share some of this information with you today. So we'll move on to the next slide. So when I think about cognitive change and its impact on people, really I think about these two quotes from people who I have worked with. These are things people have said to me. And the first one is from a person with Parkinson's, and he looked at me and he just said, you know what, my place in the world is changing. And the second quote there is from a care partner who said to me, you know, this is just not the same person who I married. And, you know, while I have heard these people express these sentiments perhaps with different words, the message is certainly similar among all of those people who are living life with cognitive changes. And, you know, one of the tricky parts of dealing with cognitive change is that sometimes it's really hard to figure out what is actual cognitive change related to the condition that you might be experiencing. What is normal aging as we talk about it? And certainly what are some of the behaviors that are actually part of the core personality of the person? And then we also have fluctuations with cognition, and that makes it tricky too. Sometimes the person is perfectly clear one day and the next day may not be so clear. And so that sometimes makes it really hard to know what's fair to expect from the person who is experiencing cognitive change. And so for the care partner, and I'm not too sure if we have a lot of care partners on the call or not, but this is just valuable stuff to share with people who are in your circle of care. For the care partner, really important to remember that the behavior changes that you might be seeing in the person is not necessarily about laziness or carelessness or an intentional lack of interest. And usually they are not intentionally trying to be difficult. And for the person who might be experiencing cognitive change, it's really important to not use cognitive change as an excuse or an explanation or a crutch for all kinds of less desirable or non-compliant behaviors. So I guess I'm trying to say, with cognitive change, you can still take the garbage out when asked. Perhaps you might need a reminder or two, but it is something you can do. However, regardless of the cause of cognitive change, regardless of the associated behaviors which differ for different people, coping strategies are necessary. They're required. So we'll move on to the next slide. So I just want to take a moment to start off with talking about a few taboo topics that tend to be related to and impacted by cognitive change, and certainly have been the experience of many people who I've worked with and may be a part of your experience as well. And so the first one I'm going to talk about is shame, embarrassment, and stigma for both the person and the care partner. The second one is about difficult conversations that now need to be had because of cognitive change. And the third one is the impact of cognitive change on intimacy. Now, time today really only allows me to address each one of these briefly, but I really just wanted to raise your awareness to some of these common experiences and normalize them. And then I do have some resources at the end of the talk if you want more information. Next slide, please. So about a year and a half ago, I met a gentleman named Julio Angulo, who is a retired psychologist, also a social worker, and a person with Parkinson's, and a very active advocate. And he had a particular special interest in shame and embarrassment and stigma. And he really suggested that in everyday interactions with people, there are some symptoms of health conditions that can be misjudged or negatively judged by others. And cognitive change is certainly one of those symptoms that can be judged, or a symptom that one can feel that they are being judged about. And sometimes people tend to deal with this by starting to avoid social situations. And now it certainly makes sense that people who are feeling shame or embarrassment tend not to talk about it, because it kind of feels embarrassing or shameful to talk about your shame or embarrassment feelings. And these feelings of shame and embarrassment can certainly lead to increased anxiety, and they also may go unnoticed by family or by healthcare professionals. And we certainly know that things that are unnoticed often get untreated. So similarly, some of the behaviors associated with cognitive change can also be embarrassing for the care partner, and they may be reluctant to bring up or raise these behaviors with the healthcare team or with other families or friends. So some of the coping strategies that I will be talking about later can also help with feelings of shame and embarrassment. Strategies like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT for short. But more specifically, strategies for dealing with shame and embarrassment might include thought stopping or identifying irrational thinking, certainly disrupting negative self-talk. And all of those things can really help with managing feelings of shame. And also certainly learning how to be self-compassionate, which simply put is being kind to yourself, learning how to be kind to yourself, and that can be really valuable as well. Okay, next slide. So with time, there may be some conversations that are necessary to have as a result of cognitive change. Conversations about driving or financial management, medication compliance, or even accepting help. And then there may be some conversations that are hard to have because of cognitive change and changes in the person's ability to focus or to problem solve or to follow through on decisions made. So it's really important to recognize the emotions that are attached to these hard conversations for everybody who's involved. There may be feelings of loss, of grief, of fear, sadness, anger, and to recognize that all of these feelings are very normal and very appropriate. And so I like to recommend to people to try to be proactive. Start having conversations early on in the condition and put plans in place before a problem arises. So, for example, I worked with a woman who referred to creating a psychological family. And so these were three people who were very trusted to her. And they had an agreement that if she was making a decision or a judgment call or an action that they were concerned about, they had this conversation and this agreement in place beforehand, which she agreed to trust what they were saying. So if they were going to change her course in some way, there was this trust that they were acting in her best interests. So that's just an idea of, again, having these conversations and being proactive. Now, for the care partner or family member who might be raising a topic of concern, you want to take these conversations slowly, one topic at a time, and you always want to time it well for everyone who's involved. So maybe not at the end of the day when everybody is tired, and certainly not as you're racing out to an appointment. So really think about the timing. Consider using notes to keep everyone on track and to remember what the plans were, what the decisions were that were made. Now, advanced care planning is also another way to guide difficult topics about health issues or health wishes and values. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about advanced care planning later, but just to know that it's really a valuable process in giving people a voice and some control in their lives when sometimes they feel that they have very little control. But with respect to having difficult conversations, I've listed their 5 wishes, and the website is posted at the end, and the Conversation Project. They're both very good sites to help navigate these difficult conversations. And also there's a webinar that was done by the 3 national neurologic disease organizations on how to have difficult conversations, and that too is available online. Okay, next slide. The last taboo topic is how intimacy is impacted by cognitive change. Now, there are many side effects of health conditions that can impact intimacy, like loss of desire, depression, sleep issues. But with cognitive change, people also experience changes in self-esteem, ability to communicate. Sometimes there are role changes, and all of these things can impact intimacy as well. And for the care partner, caregiver fatigue or depression can also impact intimacy, impact interest and desire. So there's a wonderful sexologist, Sheila Silver from Portland, and she has recommendations to renew physical and emotional intimacy, and I want to share some of those with you. So the first one there is communication. And if you notice, the U and I is highlighted in red because that's the crux of communication. It involves you and I in any good communication. But with respect to intimacy, you want to talk about what is it that you miss in your relationship, or what would you like to have, rather than what is the problem with the person. So we want to minimize complaints, minimize blame and demands, and really focus on the ways of being close and focus on what you like about the person. Intimacy really does change as any relationship progresses, and so it's important to be open to the idea that with a health condition, intimacy can be much more than just sexual function. We really want to try to find ways to connect, find ways to rekindle what you've had. Maybe that's engaging in a shared favorite activity that you used to do together, going to a favorite restaurant, even a favorite coffee shop. And so the idea is about connecting with your hearts first, and then oftentimes the rest will follow. So again, I've only really touched briefly on these taboo topics, but it's really with the intention to bring your awareness to how cognitive change can impact many areas of life. And it's not just about remembering when to take your meds or what the plan for the day was. Okay, next slide. So when we think about coping with any kind of loss, there's lots of theoretical models out there to look at about loss, but I'm just going to distill it down to this one because I'm hoping this one might be helpful as you think about and make sense of what you might be feeling and think about what coping strategies might work for you. So in the beginning, it's about beginning with the acceptance of the reality of the loss and naming that loss so that you're really aware of what the feeling is that's associated. That's what's really important. You want to acknowledge it and embrace the pain associated with that loss. Then you begin to adjust to the newness and the changes that have resulted, and then slowly begin to withdraw from the loss and reinvest in a new way. Next slide. Oops. You know what? I think I messed up on my slide. So that one is the one that I just, so we'll go on to the next one now. All right, thanks. So some people have experienced many losses or challenges and seem to cope well, while others have had few losses or challenges, yet you find yourself struggling to cope. And you may wonder, like, why is that? Well, we all have our own individual styles of coping, and that individual style might be related to your temperament and inherited traits and your core personality characteristics. It might be related to external supports like family, friends, counselors, financial resources. It might be related to your personal or psychological, your internal resources. That can be related, that might include health knowledge, your beliefs, resilience, other life demands. And it also might be related to how you have dealt with challenges in the past. And so it's really valuable to kind of reflect on who you are and your resources, and based on that, choose the coping strategies that might be best for you. Next slide. Now, we know that anxiety and depression are often associated with chronic conditions and also common for people with cognitive impairment. And so again, really important to recognize, to acknowledge, and to address any feelings of anxiety and depression. And while many people are reluctant to take more medications, meds for depression, for treating depression, can be valuable because sometimes it can get you to a place when you can then use some of these other non-medicinal mood managing strategies like mindfulness or relaxation techniques or cognitive behavioral therapy, perhaps counseling and other self-help strategies. So sometimes a little medication to get you to a place where you're then able to employ some other strategies can be helpful. And strategies that we know are good for cognitive well-being certainly also are helpful in maintaining your emotional well-being. And we certainly know that emotional well-being can impact cognitive function. So things like exercise, healthy diet, engaging in meaningful activities, perhaps some spiritual connections, and certainly laughter are all very valuable mood managing strategies. Next slide. And another strategy that I want to recommend is to consider reaching out to professionals in different disciplines to investigate how they might be able to help address some of the physical symptoms that you might be experiencing. For instance, say balance or fatigue, because when those physical symptoms improve, that might lead to an improved quality of life and enhanced emotional well-being. So for example, a physiotherapist might help with falls prevention, or a speech therapist might help with a quieter voice. And those physical symptoms, if left unaddressed, could certainly lead to more feelings of loss and anxiety and social isolation. So, really consider the roles that other healthcare professionals, like a physiotherapist, an occupational therapist, the nurses, speech language therapist, massage therapist, music therapist. The options are endless as to who might be able to be on your team. And really just think about the roles that each one of them may play in contributing to your improved emotional well-being. Remember, there are many pieces to the coping puzzle. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. Oh, I think we went too far. Well, clearly I am missing some of my slides here. So advanced care planning. So I mentioned this earlier about the role that advanced care planning can play, and I just wanted to expand on it a little bit because it really is an important piece to managing our well-being. As I said before, advanced care planning can be this process that gives you control at a time when sometimes we start to feel that things are out of our control, but it also can give you peace of mind in knowing that your wishes, your values, your beliefs have been communicated to the people who might make decisions for you. So advanced care planning is a process of reflection and communication about your wishes, your values, your beliefs of what you would like care to look like if you were unable to express it yourself. And it's valuable to have these conversations with family members, perhaps with your representative if you've got that formally in place, or even just with the people who you know are going to be making your decisions. You might even want to have this conversation with your financial advisor or legal advisor, just again, really so that everybody kind of knows what is important to you, what matters most to you. And remember, the decisions that you make today about what matters most to you can change. This is not carved in stone, but it really is about having these open conversations with people. And in fact, we should all be talking about advanced care planning. It's not just because you have a chronic condition that you should be thinking about these things. It's an important piece for all of us to take part in. Next slide. So when thinking about cognitive change, I always think about the care partners that are in the picture. And so I just want to take a moment to say a few words about the value of the care partner and the important role that each of you play. Living with a chronic condition really is a family affair, and the people in your life are doing as well as they are doing because of your support. And so it's important to take care of yourself and to maintain your wellness. It's like that idea of on an airplane where the instruction is to put the mask over your face first before you help anybody who you are with. And caregiving really does require that same approach. And so here are just a few things to consider in maintaining your wellness and for the person with a condition to help promote and develop and create those opportunities for you as well. So learning about health conditions, certainly taking care of your own health, physical and emotional, avoiding isolation and loneliness, so keeping up with your social activities, certainly watching for signs of stress and how that might affect your health and your ability to provide care, and of course seek out professional help if you're feeling that feelings of depression or anxiety might be overwhelming you. And of course, look at making time for yourself, things like adult day programs or bringing in home support services. There's also support groups which can be valuable. And I think at the end of the day, I really recognize that there is an emotional component to taking action in these ways and making changes that need to be made in order to be a well caregiver. And so it really is a bit of a philosophy of self-care that needs to be embraced first and then practically put in place. Next slide. So just in closing, there are no right or wrong ways to cope because everyone is different and we all have our individual styles of coping in varying situations. Coping is a continuous process, and as you continue to make alterations in daily life and adapting to chronic illness can be a difficult journey, and having difficulty with that journey is not necessarily a sign of failure. Asking for help really takes a lot of courage, and it's certainly not a sign of weakness. Quite the opposite, it's a sign of strength. I often suggest to people that you might need to ask for what you need. Some people can't read minds and don't know what you need, and sometimes it's hard to ask for help. So sometimes even just reframing, changing the words, and rather than saying what I need help with, you can use the words, what I would find useful. And sometimes just words can make a really big difference. So the changes that you and your family are going to be experiencing may be stressful over time and require you to shift in how you respond on a physical, emotional, social, spiritual, practical level. And you might need to try out different strategies at different times. There's a Greek philosopher who once said, that change is the only constant in life. And so now we're going to switch over to Denise, who is going to talk about simplifying and streamlining tasks that are going to maybe help you to manage some of your expectations. And that slide there is some of the resources as well. And this is being recorded and will be available on our website later. So while Adam does the stuff behind the scenes to get us to the video that we have coming from Denise, I'm just going to give you a little bit of introduction on her. So Denise is an occupational therapist with the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority and is also a clinical instructor with the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy. She's been working in the MS clinic here at UBC for several years and has spearheaded the development of a student-led clinic. Denise was, as I said, unable to attend live with us today, but she has recorded her talk for us, focusing on practical strategies for cognitive function. Over to you, Adam.
There. My name is Denise, and I'm an occupational therapist in the UBC Multiple Sclerosis Clinic in the Center for Brain Health. I've been a part of the Brain Wellness Program for about a year now, and I'm excited today to be talking about some practical strategies to manage cognitive function day to day. So let's get started. I'm going to jump right into it and talk about some general rules for optimizing day-to-day cognitive function. And when I speak about cognitive function, I'm really referring to how you're able to function on a day-to-day basis given your cognitive abilities. So we're not talking about things like necessarily improving your memory or your concentration, but how can you translate these things into day-to-day function. So the first thing really is about reducing distractions. So the whole idea of multitasking has been kind of thrown out the window now, and most of us really do function best when we're able to focus our attention on a single task at a time. So even some things in the background that you may not think are contributing to a divided attention or difficulty with attention might be the facts. So consider turning off your TV, turning off your radio, reducing conversation when you're doing tasks that do require some sustained attention, like cooking, having a conversation, things like that. As much as you can, avoid trying to do two things at once. So this whole idea of dual tasking or doing two things at once, again, all it does is it divides our attention between two things. So we do two things less well in comparison to being able to focus on doing one thing at a time. Make sure to pace yourself. So even tasks that you may not think require a great deal of cognitive attention, day-to-day things like making a meal, really do require some focus, some memory, some ability to sequence through various steps. So that is using cognitive energy. And after using cognitive energy, you need a break and to pace yourself through that. So maybe switching gears and looking at doing a more physical task after that. Use active strategies, so strategies like active listening, talking through things as you're doing them. These are all ways that you're able to maintain your focus and your attention on the task at hand. simplifying systems as much as you can. So a lot of people tend to have multiple systems for managing day-to-day. So calendars on their fridge, apps on their phone, perhaps a calendar on the smartphone as well. And as much as you can, try to simplify and use a single system for organizing yourself. And that just helps, compared to having Post-it notes everywhere and a lot of different systems. Trying to find what we call a just right challenge. So when it comes to cognitive function, you don't want to simplify things too much and not provide yourself with any challenge. On the other hand, you don't want to challenge yourself too much and try to remember a list of 20 items at the grocery store when you're also maybe just stressed to get in and out, especially at this time. So trying to find that right balance of challenging yourself a little bit, but not so much that it causes a lot of cognitive fatigue and uses up too much cognitive energy to get a task done. Use functional activities to improve function. So the idea behind this is that, it's the same idea as walking. If you want to learn to walk better, walking is one of the better ways to do that. So same thing with cognitive function. You can sit and do things like Sudokus and crossword puzzles and that, but the idea that that's going to then translate into your ability to function when you're in the middle of cooking a complex recipe haven't really been shown in the research. So instead, trying to use these functional tasks like cooking a complicated recipe, managing your finances, going to the grocery store and challenging yourself every once in a while. These are good ways to improve your cognitive function day to day. And the last thing here is the idea of avoiding misattribution. So when you have a progressive neurological condition, it's easy to chalk everything up to that. So we all have cognitive slips day to day. That's normal. And just try to avoid attributing everything to your underlying condition. So if you forget where your car keys are one day, or you forget to turn the coffee pot off, these are errors that most people make day to day at some point. So just keep an eye on them. And it's not to say don't pay attention to them, but just avoid paying too much attention to them, because that can kind of feed into further difficulties with cognitive function. So I'm going to switch gears a little and talk about some specific memory strategies. I won't go into too much detail around here, but these are kind of some of the ones that I wanted to highlight that are helpful for most people. So the first one being repetition. We all probably remember this from our days back in school, but if you want to learn something, just repeating, whether you're reading it or hearing it, having that repetition over and over again is going to help consolidate that in your memory. Make sure to space that out though. Too much repetition too quickly doesn't work. So you want to repeat things, take a break, repeat it again maybe the next day, and kind of learn over time with this idea of spaced repetition. Another strategy we kind of call a stop, say it, see it. And this is the idea that you're stopping what you're doing and trying to become a bit mindful and be present in the moment before trying to complete a task or remember something. If you're walking into the living room to get your phone, the idea would be here that you stop what you're doing, you say out loud what you're going to do. I'm going to go get my phone, and you visualize it as well. So perhaps you imagine yourself picking up your phone. And the idea with this is that it's, again, just consolidating that memory a little bit more, and it's going to make it more likely that when you get into the living room, you're going to know what you're in there for. The third point here, practice remembering, is the idea that if you try to memorize things or repeat things to consolidate them into your memory, you may also need to practice retrieving those memories at times. So if you're trying to learn something new, like let's say you're trying to learn how to access your email on your computer, practice that and test yourself periodically to see whether you've consolidated that memory. That brings me to the next point about learning the right way. There's a concept that we call errorless learning that really does sort of emphasize that people learn well by learning the right steps the first time. Otherwise, if you kind of do trial and error methods, sometimes you learn your errors. So if you're going to learn a new task, again, I'll go back to the example of learning how to check your email on the computer. Have somebody sit down with you and go through it correctly the first few times, and maybe grade that activity. So at first, the person that you're working with shows you how to do it, and then you practice doing it the right way. And then maybe you do that a couple more times throughout the day, and then you test yourself to see whether you can do that again. And then maybe the last point is showing someone else how to do it, and that, again, is going to consolidate it a bit more. Asking for help is an important part. So, I mean, all of us do have some limits to our memory, and it's important when to know to ask for help. So if it comes to a safety concern, like you're struggling to remember to take important medications, or you're struggling to manage your finances, pay your bills on time, it may be time to ask someone else for help. And it may not be that they need to take over that task, but they're just sort of a second set of eyes, or someone who's just checking that it's been done. Generate lists yourself. So this idea, we call it the self-generation hypothesis. And the idea being that if you generate things to remember yourself, you're going to be more likely to be able to remember them than if someone else has generated that for you. So things like grocery lists. If someone hands you a grocery list, you know, you may be less likely to remember the items on that compared to if you've sat down and written that list out yourself. The last part here is about forming habits. So as much as you can, trying to reduce the demand to remember things by having habits and putting things in the same place. So that might be when you walk in the front door, you've got a place that your keys always hang next to the door. When you go to the grocery store, you may park your car in the same area of the parking lot and go to the same store so that you're not having to remember where things are in that store. And all this does is reduce the energy that's being used for that particular task, which sometimes then frees up more cognitive energy for other things in your day. So I'm going to talk briefly here about memory aids, because this is something that people are always interested in, especially nowadays with there being a lot of technology out there. There's a different types of memory aids depending on the activity. So for things like cooking, you can now get smart knobs for your stove. So an example of those is called the TalkTech Smart Turns. And what that does is it monitors the activity in and around your stove area and automatically shuts it off if there hasn't been activity for a while. So that's kind of like a bit of a backup plan there if somebody is forgetting to turn the stove off. Other things you could do for cooking is breaking down recipes. So instead of having one big page in front of you with a lot of different steps, maybe you split that into a couple steps per cue card, and that makes it a little bit visually easier to follow and interpret. For things like scheduling, there's lots of different options out there for calendars. Some people do better with a paper calendar in a central location, like on the fridge or on the kitchen table. Other people do well with electronic calendars, so things that you can put in your smartphone and have reminders that might go off, you know, the day before or the day of an event to remind you. There's lots of apps out there for scheduling and organization as well. An example of that is Evernote, and those can be quite helpful to be able to just, you know, maintain appointments and different things that you have to do during your day, like get grocery shopping done, pick up the laundry, pick up the kids from school, things like that. For medication management, there's blister packs, there's different dose sets that have alarms. There's also various pharmacies that will offer assistance with medication management, so they may have devices that they loan to you that help with remembering medication, or they may have a person that provides a phone call reminder. Other day-to-day function, there's things like key finders that you can attach to your key ring to be able to locate your keys if you lose them. Another kind of good smart tip is to be taking photos of things with your smartphone. So if you have a smartphone with you and you're, you know, worried about remembering where you parked your car, just take a picture of it in the parking lot. Being able to take pictures of things on your smartphone can help with a lot of things day to day and just reduce the demand again for trying to remember things. I want to talk a bit about things that influence cognitive function as well, because it's not a vacuum there. So it's important to look at other lifestyle factors and understand how they're going to influence your function on a day-to-day basis from a cognitive standpoint. So these are things like fatigue, sleep, exercise, alcohol, and mood. So for a lot of neurological conditions, fatigue can be a big piece of that, and that is a true neurological fatigue. And I mean, when you're having higher fatigue, it can present itself cognitively as well, like a bit of a slowed thinking, trouble finding your words. Sometimes it just feels as though your head's in the clouds a little bit and you struggle to focus. So that may be more fatigue related than a true cognitive impairment. Sleep is a really important function when it comes to our thinking. And, you know, there's been a lot of studies done that people who don't get adequate sleep, especially deep sleep or what we call the slow wave sleep, are going to have a huge impact cognitively. So if you're not sleeping well, that's something to address with your healthcare team, because if you're not having that deep sleep where you consolidate your memories, you're going to see that cognitively during the day. exercise has a huge benefit in terms of cognitive function. So in the short term, there's been studies that have shown that short bursts of physical activity can actually improve people's focus and attention in the moment. So you might consider, before going into a meeting at work, going for a brisk walk around the block to just make it that you're going to focus better when you're in that meeting. In the long term as well, for a lot of neurological conditions, exercise has been shown to improve outcomes from a cognitive standpoint. Alcohol and substances, a lot of medications that people with neurological conditions take can act on the central nervous system and cause drowsiness and cause difficulty with focus and sustaining attention and things like that. So it's always good to think about what it is that you're taking and could that be having an impact on you cognitively. And the last one here is mood. There's been a lot of studies that have linked depression to poor cognitive performance. So if you are experiencing a change in your mood, that's something to address as well, because it will contribute to things like your ability to remember and focus and pay attention during your day. I'm going to talk a little bit about brain breaks here because I think they're important for everyone to consider, but especially if you've got a neurological condition and you may have some cognitive fatigue on board. It's important to recognize when you need a break, and signs of needing a brain break might be that it becomes harder to make decisions, or you're struggling to stay on task. You may find yourself frustrated because you're making more mistakes, or you may find that you're just finding it harder to come up with the words or articulate yourself. So that's time that you might need a break for your brain. Ideally, most of us focus well in 20-minute chunks, and then we need a little bit of a break for our thinking. So, that may be even less so if you're struggling a bit more with cognitive fatigue. So trying to find that right balance of how much cognitive activity can you sustain before needing a bit of a break. And lots of different ways to take brain breaks. So using things like deep breathing, I talked about physical activity, going for a quick walk around the block, laughing, listening to music, even just looking out the window at the trees and the birds that you might see out your window gives your brain a little bit of a break of processing too much information. The last thing I'm going to touch on here is cognitive rehab, because this is something that might be new for a lot of people. So if you are recommended to engage in cognitive rehab, or if that's something you're interested in doing, the importance of this is that it'll start with a really thorough assessment. And that's important to understand what your cognitive strengths are and where you might have some areas that need a little bit of work. So most people tend to think their memory is the problem, but it could be really that it's an underlying issue with processing speed or attention. And if you're not targeting the right cognitive components, you're not going to have necessarily the right outcome. So cognitive rehab is really individualized. It's based on that assessment of how you're functioning cognitively, and it's goal-oriented. So looking at what is it that you'd like to be able to continue doing or do a little bit better. So that might be, being able to chair a meeting within your workplace. It might be being able to keep cooking meals for your family. So it really focuses on what those functional goals are. And it's usually delivered by a psychologist, an occupational therapist, or a speech-language pathologist. So if it is something that you think would benefit you, have a discussion with your care team, either your primary physician or your neurologist, and see if this is something you're able to access. So I'm going to end that today. I want to try to keep on time here. And unfortunately, because I'm not able to actually be with you live today, I'm just going to provide my email address here at the bottom of the screen. And please feel free to email any questions that you might have to me. I'll try to get back to you quickly. And, if you are looking for a bit of direction in terms of how to seek some support with your cognitive function, and you're not a patient of mine in the MS clinic, then hopefully I can at least maybe give you a bit of direction on how to look for that support. So thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the session today.
Well, as I suspected, Denise is exceptional in this area, and I certainly have thanked her in advance, and wonderful that she's provided her email address if anybody does have kind of more specific questions around that. And so now I don't have my gallery view on. Is Dr. Nygaard with us?
I am indeed.
Okay, wonderful. I will just do a quick introduction to everybody. So Dr. Nygaard came to Vancouver from Yale University, and he is the director of the Clinic for Alzheimer's and Disease-Related Disorders. He sees patients and also conducts research with a variety of different interests, including just basically bridging the gap between drug development and discoveries in the laboratory, and certainly discoveries with patient care. His varied research work focuses on understanding the brain mechanisms of healthy aging, which can really provide some important insights into disease processes. And so with that, I really want to welcome you and thank you for joining us today, Dr. Nygaard.
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you to Dr. Cresswell for inviting me. This is going to be a little different talk than, I guess, the research activities you mentioned there. We are very engaged in preventive approaches to kind of preserving the brain, and I think that's what the wellness program is very much about. So what I'm going to do today is go through what is the actual evidence for some of the most common approaches that we take in preventing dementia. So I will just kind of go through some of the studies and give you a sense of what the research shows, because I know you hear a lot about these different things, but now you'll get to see some of the evidence. So this is a figure that you will see often if you go to scientific meetings these days. This was published a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, and it depicts what are the modifiable factors in preventing, or what are the risk factors that we can prevent that may cause dementia. And you may be surprised to learn this, but if you look at that little roadmap there, hearing loss is estimated to contribute to 9% of dementia risk in midlife. So that's a big one. And there are a lot of studies now trying to see whether, so these are just associations. So does that mean if we treat hearing loss at that stage that we will also prevent dementia? That is unknown. But these are opportunities for doing studies on these different factors. And going down the list there, hypertension, so high blood pressure, accounts for 2%, which in the grand scheme of things mean hundreds of thousands of people. So it matters. And obesity is on there, or high body mass index. And if you go down in later life, smoking, depression, physical inactivity, social isolation, and diabetes. So all these things we think we can do something about. Some have been studied, and we'll go through that in a moment, and some have not. But we're still searching for answers whether these associations can actually be treated to make a meaningful change. So let me just start with a little bit of a positive note. You don't have to look very close at the slide, but believe it or not, in the last 20 years, the individual risk of getting Alzheimer's disease has actually reduced dramatically. So almost 40% reduction. That's a big number. The problem is, even though we may have a bit lower risk, we are doing so well with things like heart disease and other health issues, we live much longer. So even though our risk is lower, there are many more people with dementia, especially Alzheimer's disease, but all causes of dementia, simply because we live longer. So a bit of a paradox, but the positive message in these numbers is that the risk of dementia is going down. And why is that? Well, it's probably partly because we look at our blood pressure more. When you go to see your doctor, they will take your blood pressure, at least sometimes, and they might do something about it. Whereas, as opposed to maybe 20, 30 years ago, we didn't pay as much attention to those things. So then the central question becomes, if we treat high blood pressure, and you can treat that in many ways. You can take medication, you can go for a walk every day, you can do more exercise. All those things reduce high blood pressure, decrease your salt, for example. But the question here is, if we do that, does it impact the risk of cognitive decline or changes in your overall brain function? And the answer is, it's a little bit complicated, but this study looked at thousands of people, so 9,361 adults, and you had to have high blood pressure. And you also had to have no cognitive problems, so no problems with your memory, no problems with your processing speed or planning, so fairly normal function. And they wanted to reduce those individuals' blood pressure below 120 systolic. So that's a top number when you check your blood pressure. And then they want to see what happened. And it turns out that if you take a midlife normal population that has high blood pressure, if you treat the blood pressure to be lower than 120, they have a 19% less risk of having cognitive decline later in life. And that's a pretty big number. So if you're midlife and you treat your blood pressure, it's really meaningful. And here's another graphical representation of that, simply to show that, and the higher on this graph, the more likely you are to have cognitive decline. And you can just see visually that if you treat blood pressure to less than 120 over time, these are many, many years, 6 or 7 years down, your risk of cognitive decline is less. So that's a very important study that came out recently, supportive aggressive blood pressure management. However, as you might imagine, it's not that easy. So one interesting thing that came out is that if you treat blood pressure too much, that might be a problem too. And it turns out that those individuals that later in life have low blood pressure, they are at even higher risk for getting cognitive decline. So there's clearly a balance there between treating in midlife if you're more than 130, but not treating too much. And too much in this setting was suggested to be about 90, and I'll show you another study here. So 90 over 60. So you want to be between 120, that high number, and 90. So anywhere in between there is good, but once you get below that, you start seeing things the other way. So the take-home message here is, in midlife, if you're not having any problems with memory and those types of things, you should treat your blood pressure fairly aggressively and try to be below 120, but not too low. And I should also mention that, and back to this one again, so, things like exercise and other interventions that doesn't require pills is also a very important first step. So that's probably the way to go. Okay, so that's high blood pressure. What about other things on this list? So the other thing you heard a lot about, and I saw the previous talk you listened to, mentioned exercise. So what do we know about exercise? So the best known study to date is called FINGER. It was a longitudinal study for 2 years where people were subjected to various interventions. And I'll move this slide along here and show you what they did. So over 2 years, they got physical activities training, so 1 to 2 times a week. They got muscle training 2 to 3 times a week. They got cognitive training. So you did a computer software of some program that sort of trained your memory and other things, and some social interventions. So 4 things, quite a few things, as well as some advice on general health. So what happens if you do that for 2 years? Well, these are sort of big names here that you may not immediately know what it means. But the bottom line is they got a little bit better. Not so much on memory, that's the bottom right there. But in terms of processing speed, so how quickly you process information got a little bit better. The way you plan things or multitask got a little bit better. And your overall function got a little bit better. But what we don't know is whether these types of interventions, including exercise, prevents the onset of cognitive decline. That's actually unknown. It looks like in people who are who do not currently have any problems with memory and other things, it seems to help them in terms of preventing future decline. But if you have problems already, the data are a little bit more iffy, and that's shown in this study. It's called the DAPA trial. That was a couple of years ago. And I'm going to show you here. So they looked at hundreds of people who did have problems. So these individuals had dementia, and they randomized them to exercise, and another group did not get exercise, and they wanted to see how the exercise group did. So you might think that if you have dementia and you exercise, you get better, but that's not necessarily true. So this is a bit of a busy slide, but I want you to focus here down on the results section. So the pink numbers, 21.4, 22.9, 25, those are the outcomes in terms of your cognitive function. And in this case, higher is worse. So you can see the number goes up from about 21 to 25 after exercise. It means they're getting a bit worse. The other group who didn't exercise as much got a bit worse too, but not quite as much. And it turns out in this particular group, exercise actually made them a little bit worse. So the take home from this, not to scare you, is that we think again that midlife is probably the area we want to focus on. So exercise is probably incredibly important if you don't have any cognitive problems already. If you do, I think exercise and all types of activities still have a very important role in overall health. It's a little bit less clear whether, again, if you have established dementia, for example, if you have Alzheimer's disease, it's a little unclear whether exercise will actually help your memory. That's something we think may not be the case. It has a wealth of other health benefits, but just thinking of, does it change the Alzheimer's trajectory? And that's a little less clear, but it's clearly very important in preventing any decline in memory or other things. So exercise remains important, as does hypertension, as you saw. So here's the recommendation at the bottom left here. Again, there's moderate to strong evidence that if you have normal cognition, exercise is important to reducing cognitive decline. But then you see on the right here, it's a little less clear if you have impairments already, how much it really helps. So that's why we focus the most in terms of these advice on people who are sort of in their midlife and don't have any problems, but may be concerned that they could get problems later on. So I'm going to skip over this one just in the interest of time and talk just a little bit about something called the lipid diet. So many of you may take vitamins and other things that can be good for the brain. And they're probably not bad, but this was a 2-year intervention in, again, people who were at risk for getting dementia. And you can see all those supplements there: EPA, DHA, phospholipid, vitamin E, vitamin C, folic acid. All these things seem to be very good for the brain. But unfortunately, in this particular study, it didn't seem to have a big benefit. So exercise and hypertension, very good. We're a little less clear whether supplements, including these ones, have an impact. And then the last thing I want to mention is NSAID. There's been a lot of talk about non-inflammatory, so aspirin even, or ibuprofen. This was a very big study on a type of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory called naproxen, and it looked like that did not really work. So if you're in the habit of taking naproxen or ibuprofen, probably not going to be helpful in preventing memory problems and other things. And that's just something to show that. So I wanted to keep this relatively straightforward. The conclusion of these studies is that if you're in midlife and you don't have any problems with memory or other things, but you're concerned that you might, controlling your blood pressure and exercise are very, very important and should be recommended for everybody. It's a little less clear, as you've seen, if you have Alzheimer's disease or other types of dementias already, or have problems with memory. It's a little less clear just from those perspectives. So again, from a memory perspective, whether these interventions are helpful, but it's also important to note that exercise is important for many other things, physical activity, or your general well-being. But this talk is more about whether the process of Alzheimer's disease can be changed, and that's much less clear. We didn't cover this as much, but ketogenic approaches seem to be somewhat impactful. Unclear role for supplements, and probably not a role for anti-inflammatories. So with that, thank you again, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nygaard. That was really informative, and actually was a nice tie-in of many things that myself and Denise also said. So we'll open it up where we are just at 1 o'clock, but certainly if there's somebody has a burning question, a burning issue, feel free to unmute yourself and ask that question, or we can put it in the chat as well. Any questions from anybody? So we have one in the chat that says, what is midlife? That is a great question.
Yeah,
things
so
happen.
most of the studies have said 50s and 60s, but I would say midlife in some sense, at least in the context of these studies, is it's almost any age if you have no difficulties with memory of other things. But generally speaking, I think the holy grail of prevention is probably 50s. Just knowing. Let me just give you a very simple example. If you have Alzheimer's disease, we now know that that process started 20 or 30 years before you have any symptoms, which means that most people with Alzheimer's disease start having problems in the brain, even though they don't know it, in their late 40s and mid 50s. So that's why we think that prevention strategies and then also midlife would probably be 50s, mid 50s, somewhere there.
Thank you. Well, with that, and given that we are at just past 1 o'clock and it is a beautiful day in Vancouver, and many of you may want to go and have some lunch and carry on with some wellness activity outdoors, I just want to thank you all for joining us today. You will be receiving an evaluation survey in the next few days about today's session. Please take the time to respond to that. We really take your feedback very seriously, and it really helps to inform us as to what's working and what needs to be tweaked, and certainly any other ideas that you might have for future talks going forward. I think the other thing I'd like to mention is that we're coming to the close of our spring program, but are certainly in the middle of putting together our summer program. So do stay tuned to the Brain Wellness website for continuation on of some programs and some new ones for the summer. And feel free to share that with your friends and family and community. Anything you'd like to add, Silky?
No, that's perfect. And I know we're over time already, so I will not keep anybody. Again, I would thank our donors and everybody who's on the video call today. Just absolutely lovely to have you here.
Thank you, everyone, and be well.
Cheers.